Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Security 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer here with a shirt that says the S in hacker stands for sleep. I love
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah. There's no S in hacker. I don't know if you knew that or
Yeah.
not when you made the shirt, but is that your shirt that you made?
Yeah. I made it. Yep.
I love that, dude. That's so cool. We need to
Yeah.
put a link to your shirts in the description of the
Yep.
episode.
Ethical
So,
threat on Etsy.
there you go. Yeah.
So,
I have several of your shirts, and I'm a huge fan. So really
Yep.
neat stuff. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about insecure Active Directory protocols, and so we're basically going to talk about several of these protocols that can be found in Active Directory environments, and most of them create some sort of security issue, right? That we're going to talk
Yep.
about. Many of these, I think, are legacy protocols. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
Yeah, so they've been around for some time. I know several of these were routinely exploited during my time of doing internal pen testing, which was well over like 4 years ago. So
Yep.
that said, we're going to kind of step through these, and this is definitely another one of your babies. So I'm really just along for the ride, and really
Yep.
just looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it. So you want to kind of take us,
Yeah,
take
for
us
sure.
away?
So in doing pen tests week after week, there's some commonalities we see a lot of times with the findings, right? Because as unique as many organizations are from one another, there's still very common findings because Active Directory is the same in one environment versus the other, right? It's the same Active Directory. Windows is generally the same. Versions are different, but there's a lot of commonalities I see with internal pen tests related to these protocols. And some organizations are a little bit better at it than others from a maturity standpoint. But really, the goal of this episode is to talk about some of these protocols, talk about the risks that they present to an environment, to a network, and talk about how they can be remediated. So that's really the goal of this is that. And I want to point out that there are several tools that I use for identifying these issues. Some of them are just as easy as like looking at your network adapter settings, right, for LLMNR and things like that, looking at group policies. But a great tool that I always shout out and I always talk about, and it's probably nauseating for people at this point, is PingCastle. PingCastle is a super great Active Directory like health assessment tool. It can find everything from very, very grave, like very disastrous vulnerabilities, like ESC1, if you're kind of following along, if you're familiar with that nomenclature, which is a privilege escalation flaw with Active Directory certificate services templates, all the way to, your domain functional level is out of date, so it can find hygiene items, can find security items, overall, just a really great health assessment tool. And I'll also shout out Purple Knight, which is great. PingCastle is now owned by Netrix, and Purple Knight is owned by Sempris. Both have very, very robust libraries of misconfigurations and vulnerabilities related to Active Directory. So really great tools to check out.
And there's some overlap. Right, there's some overlap between them, but there are also some unique findings that are unique to each tool, right?
Yep, for sure. I've talked about this a little bit before. I don't think I've done an episode specifically in a while, but PingCastle and Purple Knight, a lot of overlap in terms of the findings and what they identify. You'll get most of the same results with various kind of nuances to the findings, to their reports, and how they're structured and laid out. PingCastle is a little bit more pen tester friendly, in my opinion, because you are able to run scans for specific things. And I've talked about that before on the podcast and on social media. Like with PingCastle, you can run a scan to identify all the third-party antivirus products that are installed on a certain set of hosts. Whereas Purple Knight is just a little different. And I like PingCastle a little bit more because Purple Knight is a series of PowerShell scripts. And it gets all run by like this one master binary that you run. And anyways, it's just a long kind of discussion rabbit hole that I go into.
Yeah. Well, the reason I bring it up is and I don't want to get too far away from the main topic here, but in a lot of cases in the pen testing world, we have multiple tools that do the same thing. right?
Absolutely.
And we do that for a reason, and that reason usually is minimize false positives,
Yep.
to get additional information. Some tools are better at finding things, other tools are better at how they report them,
Yep.
and so there are, in many cases, will be multiple tools. But
Yeah, and I was on a
yeah,
podcast yesterday that'll I think it's getting released next week. It's
hmm
called the Hacker Cache podcast, where I talked about that exact thing. The
that's
question was
cool.
like, why is your brain, the best tool for pen testing or best tool for the job? And it's because you need to understand that there are false positives. There are things that some tools don't identify.
Mhm.
There's some you can run into issues when running the tools. Maybe they don't work, or in a pen testing scenario, right? Maybe they're blocked. So you have to have multiple ways to kind of perform the same thing or identify the same things, which is absolutely critical to what we do.
Yeah, I just put that in our podcast list because I think it's a great idea. Is eliminating false positives in offensive security services.
Yep.
So
Yeah, it'd
anyway,
be a great topic.
back to the actual topic at hand. My apologies.
Yeah, no worries.
So let's dive into it.
Yeah, so I think the most infamous one is probably LLMNR, LLMNR and NBNS. Probably aside from NTLM v1, right? I think LLMNR is probably one of the most prolific and infamous protocols in Active Directory.
Also, the most mispronounced protocol in the history of
Right?
security, if not right there with LSAS. But anyway,
Yeah, it's such a tongue twister. Well, it's because you say it's like LLMNR stands for
Yeah.
Link Local Multicast Name Resolution, and then NBNS is Net BIOS Name Service, and both of those are like precursor to DNS, right? They're failback resolution mechanisms for when DNS fails. And if you don't have functioning DNS, like if you have a work group, right, and you don't have a domain controller or you don't have DNS and things like that, LMNR is great, right? Because then all the computers and kind of systems in that work group can kind of communicate a little bit more easily. So LMNR is, like I said, and NBNS are legacy protocols. If you have an environment that has well-functioning DNS, those protocols are not needed. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what team you're on here, they're default enabled, right? So they're just enabled by default. You stand up a Windows machine, and LLMNR and NBNS are enabled by default for backwards compatibility.
Sure.
The problem is these protocols can be poisoned. What's called, poisoned being you can trick, computers on the network into communicating with you. So a typical attack, and for those listening, this is probably one of the most, well-known of the protocols, but there are relaying attacks and poisoning attacks that can happen. And what that looks like, just at a super high level, we're not going to get super deep into it, but essentially computers on the network, when somebody goes to a share, right, and they mistype it, and maybe it's file share 1, but they type in file share without the E, right? It's going to go out on the network. Your computer's going to go out on the network and say, hey, does anybody have this computer? And all the computers are going to respond and say, no, no, no. But if you are an attacker on the network, you say, hey, I have that server. The computer's going to be like, cool, awesome, great. And then our attacker machine is going to be like, hey, just send us your password or authenticate to us, and we'll give you access to this share. And then that's how these LMNR attacks, these relaying attacks, these poisoning and man-in-the-middle attacks kind of happen with this specific protocol. It kind of gets in the middle of that DNS-like traffic and tricks that computer into authenticating. You can steal password hashes. If the hash that's being used is NTLM, just straight NTLM, that can be used for relaying attacks, where you take that authentication request that's coming to you, the attacker, and you pass it on to, say, a server or a domain controller. So this could be used for privilege escalation, lateral movement, and a number of other kind of attacks within Active Directory. So it's probably the most popularized one because it's been so much talked about. There are tools like Responder or Invade that you can use to like mostly automate the attack against this.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty popular one.
Well, I will say, again, going back to my base of knowledge, Responder was kind of the go-to for internal pen testing. And, in a lot of cases, if you didn't get anything with Responder, your attack surface is limited in what you can do on an internal pen test in the old style of traditional network-based internal pen testing. So yeah, I mean, this was a fundamental core of internal pen testing for the longest time, and it sounds like it still may be a large aspect of it.
Yeah, the kind of the meme that goes along with this is like domain admin by lunch, right? And it's just by using responder and cracking hashes or relaying. Fortunately, this is something that I've seen be less and less common over the last few years. I'm seeing more and more organizations create group policies, which we'll talk about here in a second, to mitigate this. So I'm not, and honestly, I'm trying to think back to a recent pen test where this was successful. I will, before I run Responder or Inve in the environment, I will check to see if they have a group policy to disable LLMNR and NBNS. And if they do, I don't even bother running it because I know that
it can be detected.
Yeah, exactly. So, but organizations are getting pretty good at this. Like I said, I haven't seen, or I haven't, abused LLMNR or NBNS in any recent kind of engagement that I can remember that I actually got anything meaningful. I think the best I got recently was I caught some Nessus scanning. So when Nessus scans, it tries to like log into web pages and like tries to hit stuff. And since Responder is setting up or Inve is setting up like, these fake things to interact with, like SMB shares or web forms, Nessus will actually send data like root or admin and try and find vulnerabilities.
Sometimes they'll use legitimate accounts too to capture those.
Yes, and I have gotten that before, but as of recently, this has been pretty good with most of the clients we've been working with. So,
and if I'm not correct, Responder is a wrapper around Inve, right? Inve was kind of the original tool.
Responder was the original tool written in Python. And then Inve is the C#.NET alternative to it.
Okay, I had it backwards.
Obviously the PowerShell version as well. But yeah, this is one that I see often, but not as fruitful on engagements, especially with organizations who have remote employees and they don't have typical like internal offices as much. They're much more hybrid. We get put on a network or it's not the user segment, things like that. But LLMNR is can be pretty easy to abuse if it is enabled in the environment. Unfortunately, it's a quick win. You disable LLMNR via group policy. You create a default you create this policy in your environment, and then you can disable the LLMNR protocol on all your machines. NBNS is a little bit different. It's a little bit more of a pain. You have to disable it on all your network interfaces. But you can still deploy group policies for that, or however you kind of manage your systems, Intune, things like that. It's very easy, straightforward to mitigate.
Is there any functional level that nukes this from an AD domain environment perspective?
Not that I'm aware of. There's no default configuration or anything like that, or
so
new functional levels.
This is something you have to manually go turn off. In some capacity. There's no way. Okay, cool. Good to know.
Stuff like web client is getting nuked. Like I think in Windows 11 it's disabled by default, whereas in Windows 10 it's enabled by default but not running. Right. So some stuff like that is starting to get more nuked.
Okay, cool. Good stuff, man.
The other one, which is very popular, this one I abuse much more, is Spooler, the Spooler service on domain controllers. So the Spooler service manages print jobs and printers on a system. Unfortunately, the Spooler service is coercible, which means that we as a remote attacker can trick that machine into authenticating to us or to some target machine, or targeting, or authenticate to another system essentially. So this is actually much more common to see from and be able to abuse from an attack perspective. This does, for all of these, I think it's helpful to kind of preface that none of these are just inherently vulnerable by like default. Just the fact that LLMNR is enabled or you have the Spooler service running on a DC doesn't necessarily make it, a critical vulnerability. A lot of these, if not all of these, have to be combined with other attacks or other abuses to really, see the full benefit from. But in the case of the Spooler service, you can combine this with a number of different techniques, attack techniques, related to certificate services. So you can you can trick a domain controller to authenticate. You can relay that to an ADCS web enrollment service and request a certificate as the domain controller and get like a domain controller machine certificate and then authenticate as that domain controller. If you have Kerberos unconstrained delegation enabled on a server, for example, those Kerberos tickets are now stored in memory because of that. And if you coerce the domain controller to authenticate to that server that has unconstrained delegation on it, you could pull those Kerberos tickets out of memory and abuse it that way. All of which are kind of very, not necessarily sneaky, but not typical things that you would see like an alert for outside of the tools that are used for those, right? Like the network-based detections for it are all still very kind of novel, I would say, from an attack or from a detection standpoint, because so much of our detections are endpoint-based. So outside of the tools, it can be hard to spot some of that, which is why it's really important to kind of identify these types of issues and mitigate them early on.
Okay, so is the Spooler service running by default on domain controllers currently?
Yes.
Okay. That's questionable, yeah. But I mean, generally speaking, the only time you'd ever need that, you shouldn't ever. But let's say that you did have a printer hooked up to your DC, and the only time I can see this happening is like a very small environment, right?
Yeah, most
like
of the time,
small remote office or something like that. But generally speaking, not cool. And look, man, best practice of having printers on DCs has been a no-go since I can remember. Right, like since I got my MCP for like Windows 2000. We weren't running printers on domain controllers. So the fact that this service is even enabled by default is bizarre to me, but not surprising because it's Windows, it's Microsoft, man.
Yeah, so if you're listening and you have a small office or you have remote satellite offices and you're using your DCs as like a file server and a print server, this is the most likely scenario. In other instances, it's just like you said, it's disabled or it's enabled by default because it's enabled on Windows Server and Windows operating systems in general. So it's just enabled by default. So disabling it is super easy, right? You create a group policy that disables it, and away you go. It's super easy. But also for all these too, it's a good idea to regularly audit and monitor these things. Whether you do it in your inventory management system or your endpoint, platform or whatever it is, like if you're using, whatever, a lot of those inventory products can monitor services that are started and running. They can monitor file system and all that kind of stuff to identify if these things are enabled. So it's a good idea just on top of this. But the other thing I want to mention related to Spooler particularly is when I was thinking about this, I'm like, well, the Spooler service is not the only coercible protocol, or Spooler is a service. The Print System Remote Protocol, MSRPRN, which I had to look up to make sure I got the name right. But that protocol, the Print System Remote Protocol, is just one of many protocols that are coercible or you can do forced authentication with. There are a number of other coercible methods, unfortunately. So even if you block Spooler service, there's still these other things that are coercible. Stuff like the EFS, encrypted file service, and a number of other like RPC-based endpoints are coercible. But the point here is that there are coercible services. Spooler is a big one because it's enabled by default, and it's a very quick win that defenders can enable or disable via GPO.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense, man.
So web client. I mentioned web client just a few minutes ago about it being disabled on Windows 11. It is being deprecated as far as I remember and understand. It's disabled by default in Windows 11, but not in Windows 10. The good news on that is it is not running by default in most cases on Windows. So you do have to start it. And there's something you can do to actually trick it to start. But web client itself was used back in the web dev days. If you ever use like a web dev share, which is essentially just web-based, file sharing. So it's used for that. And I think it was OneDrive is maybe one of the products that was used to that. I know Microsoft was like very popularized and used it, and then it kind of just fell off and nobody really used it. But it's a Windows service. It's a web client. It's a Windows service. It's like I said, in Windows 10, it's enabled by default, but not running. And the reason this is kind of a tricky one and kind of dangerous is because it also can be used to trick and kind of coerce, not necessarily coerce authentications, but yeah, I guess I would consider coerced authentication based on what it's doing. But again, another coerced authentication attack. Mm-hmm. So the way this kind of looks and works is you coerce a client that has web client running. Mm-hmm. So the web client service has to be running, and you use that authentication, and you, instead of making instead of authenticating over traditional SMB, you use HTTP, and that allows you to use NTLM, just straight NTLM, in a relaying attack. I have actually used this technique before on engagements to pivot to admin workstations. Right. So one of the techniques I like to use is look for an admin workstation, like an IT workstation or something like that. I like to check and see if web client is running on that host, because if it is, we can coerce that authentication and gain access to that system just because that web client service is running. So this one can also be pretty dangerous depending on where it's running. So imagine if web client is running on a server somewhere, it could allow you to potentially, pivot and move laterally to that machine.
Wow. Yeah, that's substantial.
So like I said, in many cases, it's enabled by default, but not running. Mm-hmm. And one of the kind of caveats with web client is you can trick it into running. So if you are on a pen test, you can actually plant a specific type of file on like a file share. And if somebody navigates that file share, it could automatically start the web client service just by viewing it. You know how you look at files and you can change the preview?
Yep, the preview pane, yeah.
Yep. So if you change the preview and it's like an image file or something like that, that could actually trigger the web client service to start.
That's cool.
So it's a little bit of a kind of a nuanced thing, but that is very possible, very likely. Less so than I would say Spooler and kind of LLMNR kind of thing, but in specific scenarios, this one can definitely allow for lateral movement. Mm-hmm. As far as remediation, this one can be tricky depending on if you have any applications that rely on it. And this would be, like I said, like OneDrive type applications where you have remote file sharing. Most, I think, don't use web client anymore outside of the Microsoft world. So you're probably okay, but just know if you disable it, by default on all your workstations or something like that, you could run into, some issues if you have applications, particularly file sharing applications that rely on it.
Yeah.
But like I said, good news, web client is deprecated by default in Windows 11, so it's disabled. But
love it, man. Yeah, very good. Yeah, WebDAV's been around for a very long time, and there are a lot of legacy enterprise type on-prem applications that rely on it. When we see WebDAV on external pen tests, it's always a red flag for us, right?
One of the fun things is, so sometimes I will use, what's it called? The Power PS tools, like
PS Exact and stuff like that. Yeah.
Suite. Yeah. They actually have a WebDAV share, so you can like map the WebDAV share on a client's machine and just like run PS Exec or like whatever you want. I've done that before, just for fun.
Love it.
So SMBv1, that's a should ring a lot of bells. That was the protocol that was responsible for Eternal Blue. And if you remember WannaCry back in 2017, I think it was, right? The CVE was for 2017.
Yep.
So SMB obviously is the network communication protocol. It's used for sharing files, printers, etc. SMBv1 obviously is pretty out of date and insecure. It lacks a lot of modern security mechanisms, particularly what's called signing. And signing is when the messages have a certificate along with them. If they don't match, then the request fails. So SMB1 doesn't have that. And because of that, we're able to use that in relaying attacks. So we can relay NTLM over SMB. And like I said, Eternal Blue, WannaCry, if you remember that, Hysteria, that has since been patched. But like I said, SMB1 does not require signing. So it's just an abuse vector that should be pretty easily mitigated in most environments.
Yeah.
There is a quote from Ned Pyle who I like to share because it's super funny. So anytime I talk about SMB, I think this is funny to share in homage to Ned Pyle, who was a principal program manager at Microsoft for like almost 20 years. He says, running SMB1 is like taking your grandmother to the prom. She means well, but she can't really move anymore. Also, it's creepy and gross.
I mean, it tracks. It tracks.
It's an infamous SMB1 quote. So,
Good stuff, man.
SMB1 legacy protocol lacks modern security mechanisms like signing. Should be relatively straightforward to disable in most environments.
So is it still enabled by default or enabled by default currently, or is it
newer Windows operating systems? It's not. So it is something that if you needed, you would have to enable on newer operating systems, which is great.
Good.
It's kind of going the way SMB1 NTLM-v1. It is going the way of being deprecated and is deprecated in most cases. NTLM-v1 though, our last one on the list, has not fared as well from a deprecation standpoint, just because it's like it's core to what Windows and authentication is in an Active Directory environment. So that's the next one is NTLM 1 or V1. And NTLM is a family of authentication protocols. And I wrote in my notes, it's kind of like SSO plus challenge response behind the scenes for Windows. We won't get into like the super nitty gritty as much as we can, but NTLM v1 obviously was superseded by NTLM v2, which is superseded by Kerberos, which is now like the default in Active Directory. NTLM by itself is vulnerable to several attacks, which are pass the hash and downgrade attacks. So pass the hash, kind of going back to what we talked about with Responder and LLMNR. Responder is the means by which you can, capture those authentications. NTLM and NTLM v1 are the method by which, or the authentication material you need to relay. So they kind of work together. So like I said earlier, these are not just inherent critical by default. There's other prerequisites and other things you need to abuse these things. But passing the hash is as old as pen testing is probably, or since it was, first discovered. But passing the hash is kind of what it sounds like, right? You obtain a password hash, in this case NTLM, and you use that authentication hash or that authentication material to authenticate to another system in the environment. So maybe it's a server, a DC, a workstation, whatever, but it allows you to authenticate to that host and pivot and move laterally, and even PrivEsk as well.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, I'm very familiar with NTLM. It's been around, like you said, forever. And it's something that we've been attacking since the inception of internal pen testing, really.
Yeah, that's been the internal pen test playbook is Responder, NTLM hash, relaying with NTLM relay X, or using something like CrackMapExec, which is now NetExec, to use that hash and see if that hash is an admin anywhere. And once you have that password hash, you can do a lot with it, from relaying to using it to authenticate, etc. So passing the hash is one of the major attacks against NTLM v1. The benefit obviously is you don't need the plain text password if you have the hash.
Right.
Now the other attack is downgrading. Now this is something I see less often. And just as a general note, NTLM v1 I'm not seeing as much anymore, which is great. So most clients I'm seeing are still not, or are doing a good job with not supporting NTLM v1 in the domain.
Mm-hmm.
But downgrading is definitely an attack vector if NTLM v1 is allowed in the environment. And if you're looking at like your group policies, if you look at your default domain policy, there's something called a LAN manager authentication level. And we look for that on internal pen tests. And if that's 2 or less, then there is potential for this downgrade attack.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, the downgrade attack, you are requesting authentication. You try and get that NTLM hash, and you downgrade it to NTLM v1. That then is you can crack that hash and use it to create like a silver ticket in the environment, which is just another form of authentication in the environment. So you get an NTLM v1 hash, you crack it back to just plain NTLM, and then you can use that to authenticate to the domain. So that's probably the most dangerous attack, I would say, with NTLM v1, aside from passing the hash and relaying.
Yeah.
When it comes to those group policies, like I said, the LAN manager authentication level, 2 or less is definitely dangerous. The default is 3. So the default 3 says that client devices use NTLM v2 authentication, and they use NTLM v2 session security if the server supports it, and the domain controller accepts LM, NTLM, and NTLM v2. So that's the default, which is fine. The goal is to get to level 4, level 5, where it's just using NTLM v2. Most environments can't quite get there, but usually 3 or 4, most environments are able to get to relatively easily.
Yeah, I would imagine if you have anything older than Windows 10 or non-Windows LDAP-based systems, you probably have to have this in 3.
Yep.
Right? Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say, and it kind of depends on your environment. I know, so there's auditing you can turn on. There's some auditing that you can turn on to kind of identify where these authentications are happening. So if you're struggling with this, my recommendation would be to look at the documentation for turning this auditing on and try to identify what hosts or where those authentications are coming from and try and segment that out. What a lot of organizations will do is they will use their containers or just their logical structure of their environment to separate, like, hey, all these servers over here, we don't need NTLM v1. We can like completely disable it. We're good. Over here, you know, we're not so lucky. We've got these few things, and you can separate it out by group policy and by container and kind of separate it that way, which is a good approach, at least to get started on it. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, good stuff, man.
Lastly, there's LDAP relaying. So not only can you use the hash because there's no challenge response with just straight NTLM. You can downgrade it to straight NTLM and crack NTLM v1, and then you can relay it as well. So you can relay it through LDAP, which is just a directory service protocol, commonly known as or commonly seen within Active Directory, but not exclusively. So normally you cannot relay SMB to LDAP because of signing, unless you're using SMBv1, right? So this is gonna get in the weeds. And now that I read my notes, I'm like, man, this is like kind of getting a little in the weeds, but hopefully everybody can stick with me on this. So there's something called message integrity code, which is a MIC shorthand, and it verifies the integrity and the identity. It's available on NTLM v2. So what this attack looks like is if you're able to downgrade an authentication to NTLM v1, which doesn't support like this message integrity thing. Right. And there's no signing, like SMB signing, or sorry, LDAP signing in this case, then relaying becomes possible. Okay. So again, signing, whether it's SMB or LDAP, whether it's this message integrity thing, that helps protect against these relaying attacks and pass the hash type attacks. These older protocols don't support those things. They don't have the message integrity. They don't have the signing features. So if you have those legacy protocols enabled, attackers are more likely able to abuse those for lateral movement, for privilege escalation, because those modern security mechanisms don't exist in those older protocols. Yep. So LDAP relaying in this case, where you take an NTLM v1 hash, you relay it over LDAP, and you get a ticket as the user or the machine or whatever the case may be. So you can kind of combine some of these. So like the Spooler service plus a downgrade attack, you relay it over LDAP, and you get a ticket as like the domain controller.
Right.
Would be an example. So you're kind of combining some of these things that we talked about in this podcast to do some magic. And when it works, and when you pull this attack off and you perform it, whether it's in a lab or a production environment, it does seem like magic because the tools just work so well
Right.
when all the conditions are right that it's like, how does this even work? You just like run a command and now you're a domain controller. It's like, it feels like magic and it feels wonderful from a pen test perspective.
Sure.
But it
Maybe
just
not
shows
so
how
much
easy it
for
can
the
be.
blue team.
Yeah. So
Good deal.
Yeah. So those were the main ones I want to talk about. Those are things that I see oftentimes enabled environments or that we abuse in environments. So hopefully that was helpful for those listening. Hopefully it wasn't too in the weeds and in depth and kind of nerded out.
Yeah, man. Look, I think a lot of folks, especially kind of early on in their IT career, look at Active Directory as, and you've said this, so I'm kind of stealing this from you, but it's an identity management platform, right? And I think there is this assumption, this kind of overarching feeling that it should be secure. And unfortunately, in a lot of
Yep.
cases, it's not, right. And so we have to your point, know your environment really well and
Yep.
understand the intricacies of it. And it's a big lift, right? It's hard for people that are out there, even if you're an MCSE or a
Yep.
seasoned veteran, there are new attacks coming out all the time, and it's a constant
Yep.
evolution. And and then add on top of that Microsoft changes everything every couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
and it just becomes this huge black box that
Yep.
is difficult to manage. And then on top of that, you got to keep changing the security configuration. So I think
Yep.
these are important topics to cover for people to understand that Windows and Active Directory is not out of the box where you want it to be necessarily.
Yeah, I often say Active Directory is for administration, not security.
Yeah.
Very much so. And I also commonly say that you have to know what to look for and where to look with a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And the same goes with these protocols and these abuses. Many IT admins are familiar with Spooler services, and they're familiar with DNS, and they're familiar with all of these things. They're less familiar with the abuses of those things,
Right.
because those aren't necessarily covered in a lot of those typical sysadmin, MCSE type training courses and things like that, or things they've learned coming up through the ranks, right? So that's why I get so excited about talking about this stuff, especially with IT admins and sysadmins, because many sysadmins are wearing many hats, as you know. Like they're the IT guy, but they also have to patch systems, and they also have to manage the EDR. And they're doing a lot of security jobs,
Yep. And this is, not to make this a sales pitch or anything, but this is why we do internal pen testing. It is because it's our job to stay on top of what the recent attacks are, attacker, bad guy, TTPs, and all of those things, so that we can deliver that information to them based on their environment, and so that they don't have to necessarily keep up with all this stuff. But at the same time, an internal pen test is really just an audit of internal policies and processes, right? And we can identify those. And that's really what you've pointed out in a lot of these remediations is we should really just be checking the box of, they got this disabled. No, they're not running Spooler service on DCs, as opposed to, hey, we're domain admin now by lunchtime on Monday, right?
Yeah, internal pen test for me is as much a QA as it is like educational and information for the client and guidance.
Exactly. Completely agree with that. All right, folks, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for listening and or watching. If you like this kind of topic, we want to hear from you. We want to know what you like to hear. We have several of these semi-technical introductory podcast episodes at this point. And so, if you're watching us on YouTube, leave a comment. Let us know what you like, if this is your cup of tea. If you're listening to us on audio only, we have contact information in the description of the podcast. We want to hear from you. Otherwise, check us out at offsec.blog, and we'll see you next week.